My name is Daisy. I'm in my mid-30s, a mother now, and for most of my adult life, I was known as the steady one, the calm one, the woman who didn't raise her voice, didn't demand attention, didn't make scenes. If you asked people who knew me back then, they would have said I was reliable, practical, maybe a little too forgiving. Some might have called me soft. Others would say I was low maintenance, as if that were a compliment. I've learned that when you move quietly through the world, people often mistake that for emptiness, or weakness, or compliance. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone or painting myself as a victim who finally snapped. I'm not here to perform anger for you, or to ask you to take sides. I'm here because there's a kind of betrayal that doesn't explode. It settles. It sinks into the body. It changes how you breathe, how you listen, how you decide what you will never accept again. What I'm about to tell you is the story of how my husband missed the birth of our child, how I was in labor for 14 hours while his phone went straight to voicemail, and what that absence slowly revealed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece, over years, through moments so small that no one else thought they mattered. This is a story about emotional justice, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that arrives when you finally stop explaining yourself. It's about psychological reversal that doesn't require confrontation, only clarity. And it's about how silence, when chosen deliberately, can become a form of strength. You won't hear shouting here. You won't hear me call anyone names. There are no villains twirling mustaches, no sudden twists of fate, no miraculous rescues. Just ordinary people, making ordinary choices, and one woman who eventually understands that being underestimated is not always a disadvantage. As you listen, you might recognize parts of yourself in who I used to be, the way I minimized my own hurt, the way I carried responsibility without acknowledgement, the way I told myself that patience was the same thing as loyalty. You might also recognize people you've loved, or trusted, or defended longer than you should have. I'm telling this now because time has given me distance, and motherhood has given me clarity. Because I don't want sympathy, and I don't need validation. I want honesty, the kind that doesn't rush to conclusions and doesn't need a dramatic ending to be true. This story unfolds slowly. It begins long before the hospital room, long before the unanswered calls, long before I understood what I was being asked to endure. And it ends not with punishment, but with a redefinition of who I am and what quiet strength really looks like. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently, without expectation. Have you ever stayed silent in a moment that deserved your voice, because you believed being calm was the same as being strong? For a long time, I didn't realize I was being edited out of my own life. Not erased completely, just softened at the edges, trimmed down to the parts that were useful, the parts that didn't interrupt anyone else's comfort. To my husband, I was steady. That was the word he used most. Steady meant I didn't ask too many questions. Steady meant I handled things. Bills, schedules, appointments, emotional weather. Steady meant that if something went wrong, I would absorb it quietly and find a workaround before it became his problem. He trusted me, he said, and I believed that trust looked like love. To his family, I was polite, dependable, the one who remembered birthdays and brought the right dish to gatherings. I was introduced less by who I was and more by what I did. She's so organized. She's great with details. She never complains. I smiled when they said those things because I thought that was what gratitude sounded like. At work, back when I still worked full-time, I was the person who caught mistakes before they reached clients, the one who stayed late without being asked, the one who didn't need praise to do a good job. Promotions passed me, but responsibilities didn't. I told myself I preferred it that way. Less attention, less pressure, less conflict. And maybe I did at first. The truth is, I learned early that being low friction made life smoother. Growing up, I was the child who didn't add to the noise. My needs were reasonable, my emotions were manageable. If something hurt, I dealt with it internally. I was praised for being mature. I didn't realize that maturity, when rewarded too early, can quietly turn into self-erasure. So when I married, I brought that same skill set with me. I listened, I adapted. I filled in gaps without being asked. When my husband forgot something, I reminded him. When he was stressed, I lightened the mood. When he was distant, I gave him space. I told myself this was a partnership. I told myself this was a strength. What I didn't see, what no one pointed out, was how quickly people adjust to a person who doesn't resist. how invisibility can masquerade as harmony. There were moments, small ones, where I felt it. A conversation where my opinion was acknowledged but not followed. Plans were made that assumed my availability without checking. Decisions discussed as if I were present but not essential. None of it was dramatic enough to protest. And that was the problem. If you complain about something small, you're told you're overreacting. If you complain about something big, you're asked why you didn't say anything sooner. So I stayed where it felt safe, in the middle, quiet, reasonable, understanding. People like that version of you. The version that doesn't ask them to look too closely at themselves. When I became pregnant, that role intensified. I was praised constantly for my calm, for my preparedness, for how easygoing I was about everything. As if carrying a child were another task I would simply manage well. Doctor's appointments were scheduled around his meetings. Birth plans were discussed briefly, then set aside. "You'll handle it," he said once, half smiling. It sounded like confidence. I accepted it as such. I didn't think of myself as invisible then. I thought I was trusted. But invisibility doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates. It's built from 1,000 assumptions that you'll be fine, that you'll adapt, that you won't mind. And when you never contradict those assumptions, they harden into expectation. I see now that who I was to them wasn't unkindly defined. No one set out to diminish me. That's what makes it harder to name. I was valued, but only in proportion to how little I disrupted the flow of other people's lives. I didn't resent it. Not yet. I wore that role carefully, like a well-pressed coat. It fit, it kept me warm, and I didn't question what it cost me to keep wearing it. Not until later. Not until silence stopped being accidental. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't bleed enough to alarm anyone. Sometimes, not even you. We were still early in the pregnancy, early enough that everything felt theoretical. Names were being considered but not chosen. The nursery was an idea, not a room. I was tired in a way that didn't make sense yet, and emotional in ways I kept apologizing for. My husband had just taken on a new project at work, one he was proud of. I could see how much it mattered to him, so I tried to make space for it. One evening, we had a prenatal appointment scheduled. Nothing dramatic, just a routine check-in. He had said he'd come. I reminded him the night before, casually, the way I always did. He nodded, distracted, already half inside the next day. That afternoon, his meeting ran late. He texted me 15 minutes before the appointment. "Go ahead without me. I'll catch the next one." I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. Not because I was angry, but because something in me hesitated. A small internal pause. I typed back, "Okay," and that was that. At the clinic, the nurse asked if my partner would be joining us. I smiled and said, "Not today." She nodded, made a note, and moved on. The appointment went smoothly. The baby was fine. I was fine. On paper, nothing was missing. On the drive home, I told myself all the reasonable things. This wasn't an emergency. He had work responsibilities. There would be many more appointments. I was capable of going alone. I preferred going alone sometimes, didn't I? That night, he apologized briefly, not with guilt, just acknowledgement. "It was a crazy day," he said, already turning the page. I said I understood, and I meant it. But something lingered. Not hurt, not anger, just awareness. It wasn't about that one appointment. It was about how easily the decision had been made, how little discussion there was, how natural it felt for both of us to default to me handling it. After that, it happened again and again, small things. A dinner with friends he canceled at the last minute because he was tired. A weekend plan that shifted because something else came up. Each time, I adjusted. Each time, I told myself this was what flexibility looked like. What struck me wasn't his absence. It was everyone else's reaction to it. No one questioned it. Friends shrugged. "That's just how work is." His mother laughed it off. "Men get overwhelmed." Even the doctor once said kindly, "At least you're independent." Independent, as if that were the goal. I started noticing how often I filled in gaps without being asked. How often I preemptively lowered my expectations so no one else had to disappoint me. I didn't bring it up because there was nothing concrete to point to. No single moment you could hold up and say, "This is where it started." And yet, my body noticed. A tightness in my chest when plans changed. A quiet fatigue that had nothing to do with pregnancy. A sense that I was standing slightly off-center in my own life. I didn't confront him. There was nothing to confront. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't dismissive. He was just elsewhere. and I had made it easy for him to be. That was the first small cut. Not because it hurt deeply, but because it taught a lesson. My presence was optional. My needs were flexible. My silence was reliable. I stitched it up myself the way I always did, with understanding, with patience, with the belief that love didn't keep score. I didn't realize then that I was teaching everyone, including myself, how little it cost to leave me waiting. By the time I noticed the pattern, it already had a rhythm. It wasn't that things got worse, they got smoother, more predictable. Absences were no longer explained in detail. Changes were no longer negotiated. They were simply announced. And I adjusted without comment. The language shifted subtly, from "can we" to "I'm going to." What do you think? This makes the most sense. And because nothing catastrophic happened, I told myself I was imagining it. Pregnancy has a way of amplifying doubt. You're told your emotions are heightened, your perceptions unreliable. So when something felt off, I checked myself first. Am I being sensitive? Am I expecting too much? I learned to interrogate my own reactions before anyone else had the chance to. I became very good at it. There were evenings when he came home later than planned, and I had already eaten. He'd apologize in passing, kiss my forehead, and talk about his day. I'd listen, nod, and ask the right questions. My day, doctor visits, swollen ankles, the quiet anxiety that came with carrying something fragile, stayed largely unspoken unless it was directly asked for. And it rarely was. When I did mention being tired or overwhelmed, the responses were practical. Try to rest more. You've always been strong. You've got this. They weren't unkind, but they closed the conversation instead of opening it. Strength, I learned, is often used as a reason not to show up for someone. So I stopped reaching. I told myself I was being efficient. Why explain something that would only be met with reassurance? Why name a need that would be interpreted as stress? I didn't want to be another problem on an already full plate. I wanted to be supportive, understanding, easy to be with. I didn't notice when that desire turned into a habit. Friends would ask how I was doing, and I'd say, "Good, just tired." Family members would comment on how composed I seemed. "You're handling this so well," they'd say. And I smiled, because correcting them felt unnecessary, because the truth would have required more energy than I had. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an insult. Sometimes it arrives as an assumption. The assumption that you'll handle it, that you won't mind, that you'll understand. Over time, those assumptions solidify into expectations. And when you meet expectations consistently, people stop seeing the effort it takes. I began to realize that my silence was being interpreted not as generosity, but as consent. Still, I didn't speak up. Part of me believed that naming the imbalance would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for. Another part feared that if I asked for more and didn't receive it, I would have no choice but to reevaluate everything. So I chose the quieter path. I normalized it. I told myself this was what adulthood looked like. Those relationships went through phases. That is not everything needed to be equal at all times. I reminded myself of all the good things, the stability, the history, the love that existed in gestures rather than words. And there was love. That's what made it confusing. He wasn't unfaithful then. He wasn't absent in obvious ways. He simply trusted that I would manage, and I did. I managed so well that there was no visible cost to anyone but me. Looking back, I see how carefully I protected everyone from discomfort, including myself. How often I smoothed over moments that should have been allowed to land. How I convinced myself that being patient was the same as being valued. But patience without reciprocity doesn't deepen connection. It thins it. At the time, I thought I was preserving peace. What I was really doing was training myself to accept less without naming it as a loss. And once something becomes normal, it becomes very hard to argue that it's wrong. It wasn't until I saw myself reflected through other people's expectations that I understood the role I'd been given. Reliable, useful, invisible. No one ever said it out loud, of course. Roles like that are never formally assigned. They emerge quietly, shaped by repetition. By who steps in first. By those who don't push back. By who keeps things running when others step away. I was the one who remembered. The one who planned. The one who adjusted. When something needed to be done, eyes turned to me, not with entitlement, but with relief. I was dependable in a way that made everyone else more comfortable. And comfort, I learned, is a powerful incentive to keep someone exactly where they are. My husband trusted me completely. That was how he framed it. He didn't worry about things because he knew I had them covered. He didn't check in as often because he assumed I'd tell him if something was wrong. He didn't notice the weight I was carrying because I never let it slow me down. In his mind, I was strong, capable, unshakable. In reality, I was tired in a way that had no language. During the pregnancy, that role intensified. I coordinated appointments, I tracked symptoms, I read the books, I made the lists. When decisions needed to be made, I presented options neatly, already researched, already filtered. He chose from what I offered, and I called that collaboration. I didn't ask myself why I was doing all the work to make decisions feel easy for him. When people talked about the baby, they spoke to me about logistics, and to him about excitement. They asked me about plans, and asked him how he felt. I answered calmly, he answered proudly. No one questioned the imbalance because it looked functional from the outside. And I didn't correct it. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when his sister joked, "You're lucky Daisy handles everything." Everyone laughed. I laughed too, a half second later than the rest. The joke landed lightly in the room, but it stayed with me, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. Handling everything had become my identity. What troubled me wasn't the work. It was the assumption that I would continue to do it indefinitely, without acknowledgement, without recalibration. That my role was fixed, not responsive. That I was a constant in other people's lives, while they were variables in mine. I started noticing how rarely anyone asked what I wanted, without immediately reframing it as a problem to solve. Wanting something, I realized, was inconvenient when you were valued for your reliability. Needs disrupted the narrative, so I learned to want less. I told myself that this was temporary, that once the baby arrived, things would rebalance, that we'd find a new rhythm. I believed that because it was easier than confronting the possibility that this wasn't a phase. It was a structure, and structures don't change unless someone challenges them. I wasn't ready to do that yet. Challenging the role meant risking the harmony it provided. It meant stepping out of the identity that had kept me safe for so long. It meant asking myself whether being needed was enough, or whether I wanted to be considered. So I stayed where I was. I played the role well. I kept my voice steady and my expectations flexible. I told myself that love wasn't measured in attention, but in commitment. That this was just how things were. What I didn't see then was that roles, once accepted, are rarely questioned by the people who benefit from them. And the longer you stay in one, the harder it becomes to imagine yourself outside of it. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where everything suddenly came into focus. It happened quietly, on an ordinary afternoon, in a space so unremarkable that I almost dismissed it as nothing at all. I was alone in the apartment, folding baby clothes. They were freshly washed, still warm from the dryer. Tiny socks, soft cotton onesies. I moved slowly, carefully, as if speed might bruise something fragile. The room was quiet except for the hum of traffic outside and the rhythmic stacking of fabric. It should have been peaceful. In many ways, it was. And yet, as I folded, a thought surfaced, uninvited but clear. If something happened to me, how long would it take for anyone to notice? Not in a dramatic sense, not fear, just curiosity. I paused, a onesie in my hands, and let the question sit. I imagined missing an appointment, a message left unread, a day when I didn't step in to smooth things over. The world didn't collapse in my mind. It adjusted. People filled the gaps differently. Some things went undone. Some people were inconvenienced. But nothing essential stopped. That was the moment. Not realization, not anger, just clarity. I saw for the first time how interchangeable my presence had become. Not because I was unimportant, but because I had made myself endlessly adaptable. I had removed all friction, and in doing so, I had removed any reason for others to slow down and notice me. The thought didn't hurt, it steadied me. I finished folding the clothes and placed them neatly in the drawer. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and breathed, one hand resting on my stomach, feeling the faint, familiar movement beneath my palm. For the first time in a long while, I didn't rush to explain the feeling away. I didn't tell myself I was being dramatic. I didn't search for reasons to dismiss it. I just acknowledged it. Something in me had reached its limit, not of tolerance, but of self-neglect. That evening, my husband came home later than expected. He kissed my cheek, asked what I wanted for dinner, and launched into a story about his day. I listened like always, but I noticed how little effort it took, how automatic my responses were, how I could have been anyone. And for the first time, that realization didn't make me sad. It made me curious. I began to ask myself questions I had avoided for years. What would it look like to stop compensating? To let things be slightly uncomfortable? To allow silence without rushing to fill it? Not as punishment, not as a protest, but as an experiment. I didn't change anything outwardly that day. I didn't announce a boundary or request a conversation. The shift was internal, a quiet decision to observe rather than manage, to notice rather than smooth over. It felt unfamiliar, slightly unsettling, like standing still on a moving walkway, but it also felt honest. That night, lying in bed, I realized that I had been equating peace with absence. My absence from conflict, from need, from inconvenience. And I understood finally that peace built on self-erasure is not peace at all. It's just quiet. The shift was subtle, but it was irreversible. From that day on, my silence was no longer automatic. It was chosen. Once silence became a choice, everything sounded different. I didn't stop speaking, I stopped filling. I stopped anticipating needs before they were expressed. I stopped cushioning moments that weren't mine to soften. On the surface, nothing looked confrontational, but underneath, something had changed. I was no longer managing outcomes. When my husband said he'd be late, I didn't rearrange dinner automatically. I ate when I was hungry. If he forgot something, I didn't remind him twice. If a plan shifted, I let the inconvenience exist without immediately resolving it. These weren't punishments, they were corrections, small ones, internal ones. People often imagine silence as passive, as something that happens when you don't know what to say or when you're afraid to speak. But chosen silence is different. It requires restraint, awareness, the discipline to let things unfold without intervening. And that restraint was new to me. At first, others didn't notice, or rather, they noticed but misinterpreted it. "You seem tired," someone said. "Pregnancy brain," another joked. My husband asked once if I was feeling okay. I said yes, and I meant it, more than I had in months. What they didn't realize was that I was watching, not in a suspicious way, in a factual one. I was observing who stepped in when I didn't, who followed through when I stopped reminding, who noticed my absence from certain emotional labor. The answers were quiet, but consistent. Mostly no one did. Things slipped, small things. Appointments were nearly missed. Messages went unanswered longer. Social plans became less precise. Nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to reveal how much effort I had been supplying invisibly. And still I didn't speak, because speaking would have returned me to the role of interpreter, explainer, fixer. I wanted to know what happened when I wasn't those things. My husband especially seemed unsettled, not angry, just slightly off balance. He asked more questions, but they were surface level. "Everything okay? You sure?" I nodded. I smiled. I stayed calm. He mistook my quiet for fatigue, or mood, or hormones. He didn't consider that it might be an intention. That assumption told me everything I needed to know. Silence, when chosen, has a way of holding up a mirror without forcing anyone to look. It creates space. And in that space, patterns reveal themselves. I noticed how often I had been the emotional buffer between him and discomfort, how my presence had absorbed tension before it reached him. Without that buffer, he encountered mild resistance, from life, from logistics, from his own oversights, and he didn't like it. But he didn't trace it back to me, and I didn't point it out. This wasn't about teaching a lesson, it was about learning one. I was learning that my value had been measured by how little I asked for in return. And by stepping back, I was recalibrating that measurement, not for them, but for myself. There was a strange calm in it, a steadiness that didn't rely on being needed. I felt more present in my own body, more aware of my limits, more protective of my energy. Silence had become a boundary, not one drawn with words, but with behavior. And once that line was drawn, I knew I wouldn't cross it again. While everything looked the same on the surface, I was preparing. Quietly, methodically, without urgency or drama. Preparation didn't begin as a plan to leave, expose, or confront. It began as documentation, observation, a return to myself as a thinking, discerning person rather than a responsive one. I wasn't collecting evidence with an agenda. I was collecting clarity. I started writing things down, not feelings, facts, dates, missed appointments, canceled plans, promises postponed indefinitely, nights when he said he'd be home and wasn't, mornings when decisions were made without me and presented as done deals. I didn't attach commentary. I didn't need to. Patterns speak for themselves when you let them. I also began paying closer attention to money, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because I realized how little visibility I had into something that shaped my life so profoundly. Accounts we shared, but I rarely checked. Automatic payments I'd never reviewed. Financial decisions that had always been framed as handled. I educated myself quietly, read, asked neutral questions, learned terminology, not to challenge, just to understand. At the same time, I started rebuilding a part of myself I had let go dormant. My work. Freelance editing had always been something I did on the side. Something flexible, something I could pause or resume without consequence. But I began treating it differently. I took on slightly more projects, updated my portfolio, reconnected with old contacts, not dramatically, just gently, like testing a muscle. No one noticed the shift because it didn't interrupt anything. Dinners still happened. Conversations still flowed. I still smiled, still listened, still supported. I had simply stopped overfunctioning. What surprised me most was how easy it was to do this unnoticed. I had spent years believing that any change in my behavior would ripple outward immediately, that pulling back would cause conflict, that choosing myself would be disruptive. It wasn't, because when you've been invisible long enough, people don't register your absence right away. They just experience a vague sense of inconvenience, a subtle drop in ease, a question they can't quite articulate, and they assume it's temporary. I also began preparing emotionally, not by hardening myself, but by becoming honest. I stopped romanticizing the relationship in my own mind, stopped reframing disappointments as misunderstandings, stopped using love as an excuse to ignore imbalance. I let things be what they were, without defending them. That was harder than any logistical preparation. Some nights, I lay awake and wondered if I was being unfair, if this were just a rough season, if I were rewriting the past with a critical lens. But then I'd look at my notes, at the timeline, at the consistency. Clarity doesn't shout, it accumulates. And still, this is important, I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't waiting for a moment to strike. I was simply positioning myself so that if a line was crossed, I wouldn't be trapped in confusion or dependency, because something in me knew, before I could name it, that a line would be crossed. People who are comfortable taking rarely stop on their own. What they never noticed was how much leverage comes from patience paired with awareness, from understanding systems, from knowing where you stand, even when no one else asks. I wasn't becoming colder, I was becoming anchored. And when you're anchored, you don't need to announce movement. You just shift weight quietly until the ground beneath you feels solid again. They mistook my calm for passivity. What it really was readiness. The reveal didn't come with shock. There was no rush of adrenaline, no racing heartbeat, no cinematic moment where everything suddenly made sense. It arrived the way truth often does, quietly, when you finally stop looking away. I found it on an ordinary evening while reviewing something I had once trusted without question. A shared calendar entry, a bank statement, a timeline that didn't quite align. At first, I assumed there was a reasonable explanation. There usually was. I sat with the discomfort instead of immediately resolving it. I cross-checked dates, read messages without tone, looked at facts the way I had trained myself to. And slowly the shape of it emerged, time that had been accounted for but not honestly. Gaps explained away with work, with stress, with exhaustion. Phone calls are taken in other rooms. Messages returned later than necessary. Not evidence of a single betrayal, but of a parallel attention I had not been included in. I didn't feel devastated. That surprised me. What I felt was stillness, the kind that comes when a question you've been carrying for a long time finally answers itself. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry. I didn't even write it down right away. I sat at the kitchen table, one hand resting on my stomach, and allowed myself to feel the weight of what I now knew, without dramatizing it, without softening it. This wasn't a misunderstanding, and it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, a pattern of choosing elsewhere, while trusting that I would continue to hold everything together here, that I would remain stable, quiet, understanding, that my role would not change even if his behavior had. That was the moment something settled permanently inside me. Not bitterness, not anger. Finality. I realized that whatever came next would not be about convincing him to see me differently. It would be about deciding what I would no longer accept. The clarity was almost relieving. Painful, yes, but clean. I understood then why I had been preparing without knowing exactly what for. Why had it felt necessary? Why had my instincts shifted before my mind caught up? I wasn't discovering leverage over him. I was discovering leverage over myself. The ability to act from clarity instead of reaction. to move without needing permission or validation, to make decisions that aligned with my values rather than my fears. I closed the laptop, turned off the light, went to bed. He came home later that night, kissed my cheek, and asked how I was feeling. I said I was tired. That part was true. What I didn't say was that something had ended quietly, without ceremony, and that once something ends like that, it doesn't restart. Clarity doesn't demand action right away. That was the first thing I understood once the truth settled in. There is a difference between knowing and moving. And for the first time in my life, I didn't rush to close that gap. I gave myself time, not to forgive, not to forget, but to decide. In the days that followed, I lived alongside him as I always had. Calm, attentive, composed. From the outside, nothing shifted. Inside, everything had slowed down. I watched my own reactions with the same neutrality I had used to observe his behavior. I noticed what stirred emotion and what didn't, what felt negotiable and what felt non-negotiable. There were several paths open to me. I considered them carefully, without dramatizing any of them. I could confront him immediately, demand honesty, force a reckoning, but I knew myself well enough to understand what that would cost. Confrontation would center his explanations, his remorse, his version of events. I would be pulled back into interpretation, negotiation, and emotional labor. Even if I won that conversation, I would lose my footing. I could pretend I didn't know. Preserve the structure, wait until after the birth. Tell myself this was a temporary fracture, not a foundation problem. Many people do this. I understood why. Stability can feel more urgent than truth when you're vulnerable. Or I could choose a third option, the irreversible one. Not dramatic, not cruel, just final. The option where I stopped orienting my life around his capacity to show up. Where I accepted, fully, that love without presence is not something I was willing to model for my child. Where I decided that whatever came next would be built on self-respect, not endurance. That decision didn't come with relief, it came with gravity. Because irreversible choices don't offer the comfort of "we'll see." They ask you to trust your own judgment without external confirmation. They ask you to step out of familiar pain into unfamiliar responsibility. I thought about the baby, about the quiet hours ahead, about what it would mean to teach a child, by example, what partnership looks like. I thought about the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. And I realized something important. If I stayed knowing what I knew, I would be choosing erasure consciously, not out of fear, but out of habit. And once a choice is conscious, it defines you. I wasn't willing to be defined that way anymore. So I decided not what I would say or when I would say it, but how I would move, slowly, legally, calmly, with as little emotional spectacle as possible. The decision was not to punish him, it was to protect myself. And once that decision was made, everything else became procedural. Once the decision was made, I stopped thinking in terms of emotion and started thinking in terms of structure. Not coldly, clearly. I understood that silence at this stage wasn't avoidance, it was insulation. It protected the decision while it was still forming its own spine. I didn't owe anyone an announcement. I didn't need witnesses. I needed stability. So I moved quietly. I scheduled appointments without mentioning them, asked questions without signaling intent. I learned what my options were, not hypothetically, but practically. What documents mattered, what timelines looked like, what protections existed for someone in my position. I didn't rush. Rushing creates mistakes, and I had lived too long cleaning up after other people's haste to make my own. At home, I remained consistent. I cooked, I listened, I responded when spoken to. There was no withdrawal dramatic enough to trigger suspicion, no emotional distance that could be framed as punishment. I was simply no longer compensating. And that difference was subtle enough to go unnamed. Financially, I began separating knowledge from access. I understood what was shared and what was not. I made copies, not out of paranoia, but out of prudence. Information is not power when used to control others. It's a power when used to protect yourself. I also stabilized my work, not in a way that disrupted my pregnancy, but in a way that reminded me I was still capable, still employable, still a person with agency beyond the role I had been assigned. Every step was small, intentional, almost boring. That was the point. People imagine major life shifts as storms, loud, chaotic, destructive, but the most decisive changes often look like calm routines, like consistency, like a woman who appears unchanged because she has finally stopped overextending herself. My husband didn't notice, not because he didn't care, but because he was accustomed to the infrastructure of my presence. When that infrastructure quietly restructured itself, the surface remained smooth. The consequences hadn't reached him yet, and I wasn't in a hurry for them to. I was entering my third trimester. My body was doing the kind of work that doesn't allow for emotional theatrics. I needed rest, focus, grounding, and silence gave me all three. There were moments, late at night, alone, when the weight of what I was doing pressed in, not fear, responsibility, the understanding that once certain steps are taken, they can't be undone without cost. But I didn't waver, because I wasn't acting out of impulse. I was acting out of alignment. I wasn't hiding, I was positioning. And positioning, when done correctly, doesn't announce itself. It waits. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They rarely do. At first, they showed up as confused. My husband began missing things he'd never had to think about before. Small logistics, dates, follow-ups. He'd ask questions he used to assume I'd already handled. When I answered calmly instead of preemptively fixing the problem, he looked momentarily unsettled, like someone who reaches for a light switch and finds the room darker than expected. Nothing dramatic enough to name, just friction. He forgot to confirm a work-related dinner with friends. It fell apart last minute. He blamed timing, stress, bad luck. I listened, nodded, and didn't absorb the inconvenience for him. He felt it directly. That was new. At a prenatal check-in, the nurse asked again if my partner would be joining us. I said no, without explanation. Later, he realized he'd missed another update. He apologized more thoroughly this time, with a trace of urgency I hadn't heard before. I accepted it, still calmly, still without filling the space afterward. That's when the tone began to shift, not toward anger, toward uncertainty. He started checking in more often, but the questions lacked depth. "Are we okay?" "You seem quiet," I answered honestly but minimally. "I'm fine. I'm focused," which was true. He heard reassurance where I meant neutrality. Others noticed too faintly. His family commented on how independent I seemed lately. "You've got everything so handled," his mother said again, but this time there was something tentative in her voice, as if she sensed the structure had changed but couldn't identify how. What no one realized was that the ease they were missing wasn't my mood, it was my labor. When you stop providing something people never knew they relied on, they don't name the loss. They feel it as an absence, as an inconvenience, as a subtle discomfort. They assume it will pass. And because I didn't explain it, they couldn't negotiate it back. I watched all of this with a steady detachment that surprised me. Not coldness, perspective. The kind that comes when you're no longer trying to be understood, only accurate. The pregnancy advanced. My body demanded more rest, more presence. I gave it what it needed without apology. I stopped making myself smaller to keep things running smoothly for everyone else. And slowly the cost of my previous silence began to surface. Not for me, but for them. Still, I said nothing. Because consequences don't need narration. They speak for themselves. Panic doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like effort, sudden, clumsy, ill-timed effort. By the time my husband realized something was truly wrong, the window for fixing it had already closed. Not because I slammed it shut, but because it had been quietly closing for years, while he assumed it would always remain open. The first sign was his urgency. He began offering help he'd never offered before. Not consistently, not intuitively, but pointedly. He asked if I needed anything, then stood waiting for an answer, as if the question itself should be reassuring. He started volunteering for tasks, but without understanding the system behind them. He wanted credit for participation, not responsibility for continuity. "Tell me what you need," he said one evening, standing in the doorway while I folded laundry. The words were familiar. People often think they're generous. I looked at him for a moment longer than necessary, not searching for an answer, but noticing how the question landed. Years ago, it would have opened something in me. Hope, maybe. Relief. The sense that I could finally exhale and hand something over. Now, it felt late. "I've got it," I said calmly. And I did. That was the moment he first felt the panic. Not because I was pushing him away, but because I no longer needed him to stabilize me. My independence, which had once been comforting to everyone, now felt threatening. He didn't know how to name it, so he tried to fix it with proximity. He came home earlier, asked more questions, suggested plans, spoke about the future in broader strokes. When the baby comes, when things settle down after this busy period. He spoke as if time itself would repair what attention had not. But time only heals what is tended to. I noticed how his concern was reactive, not reflective. He was responding to a shift in my availability, not to the years of quiet imbalance that caused it. He wanted reassurance that things were okay, not understanding why they weren't. That distinction mattered. One night, a few weeks before my due date, I went into early labor. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, just a slow, unmistakable tightening that told me something had begun. I timed the contractions, packed the bag I had prepared weeks earlier, sat on the edge of the bed and breathed. I called him, straight to voicemail. I called again and again. Voicemail. I sent a message, short, factual. I'm in labor. Please call me. No response. I didn't panic. That surprised me most of all. I waited. I called a third time. Then I stopped. There is a moment, when expectation finally dies, that brings a strange calm with it. I felt it then. Sitting alone in the quiet apartment, one hand on my stomach, the other resting on my phone. I wasn't angry. I wasn't crying. I was done waiting. I called a ride, grabbed my bag, locked the door behind me. At the hospital, the hours stretched, 14 of them. 14 hours of labor while his phone went straight to voicemail. Nurses came and went. Questions were asked. Paperwork was signed. I answered everything myself. When they asked if someone was coming, I said, not yet. And eventually, no. I focused on my breathing, on the rhythm of my body, on the fact that I was not in this moment alone. I was present, fully, in a way I had not been for a long time. At some point, he did call back. Hours later, apologies tumbled over each other. Confusion, explanations. He'd been caught up. His phone had died. He hadn't realized. I listened, and for the first time, I didn't fill in the silence for him. I didn't soften the impact. I didn't reassure him that it was okay. I simply said, I'm at the hospital. I'm in labor. You should come if you're coming. He arrived late, not just to the room, but to the reality. By the time he walked in, breathless and shaken, something essential had already happened without him. Not just the hours he missed, but the trust, the assumption, the belief that when it mattered most, he would show up without being managed. He looked at me differently then, with fear, with regret, with the dawning realization that this wasn't something he could apologize his way out of. I'm here now, he said. I nodded. But being present after the fact is not the same as being dependable. The days that followed were heavy. He hovered, tried to help, tried to anticipate. His panic sharpened into desperation. He offered to change, to do better, to be more involved. He spoke in promises and intentions, as if the future could retroactively repair the past. But something had shifted irreversibly. I wasn't withholding forgiveness. I was beyond bargaining. When you finally stop explaining your pain, people panic, not because they understand it, but because they feel its consequences without access to its meaning. He wanted to fix it. I wanted peace. And those two desires were no longer compatible. By the time he understood that something fundamental had broken, not emotionally but structurally, it was already too late. Not because I was cruel, but because clarity, once reached, does not negotiate itself away. I didn't shout, I didn't accuse, I didn't dramatize. I simply stopped carrying what was never meant to be mine alone. And that, more than any argument, was the moment he realized he had lost something he could not replace. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a climax. It felt like administration. There were no raised voices, no rehearsed speeches, no list of grievances was laid out like evidence in a trial. By the time we sat across from each other, at the same kitchen table where I had once discovered the truth, everything that needed to be understood had already been decided internally. He spoke first, not defensively, not arrogantly, carefully. He said he was sorry, that he had made mistakes, that he hadn't realized how much I was carrying until it was gone. He said missing the birth of our child was the worst moment of his life, that he would regret it forever. I believed him. Regret was not the issue. He waited for my response with a kind of intensity that would have once pulled me into reassurance. I could see the effort he was making to stay composed, to say the right things. It was unfamiliar to him, to be the one reaching. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, there was a pause. The kind that feels uncomfortable only if you expect it to be filled. I'm not angry, I said finally, and I'm not trying to punish you. He nodded quickly, as if relieved. But I am clear, I continued, and that clarity isn't something I can undo. That was the moment his expression shifted. Clarity is harder to argue with than emotion. You can negotiate feelings. You can soothe anger. But clarity stands still. It doesn't chase agreement. I told him, calmly, precisely, that I had spent a long time making myself smaller to keep things stable. That I had been dependable to the point of invisibility. That was when I stopped compensating. the imbalance became undeniable. I didn't accuse him of malice. I didn't list his failures. I described the structure we had been living in and how it no longer worked. He asked if there was anything he could do. It was an honest question, and I gave him an honest answer. Not now, I said. Maybe not ever. I don't know. But I know I can't go back to how things were. And I won't pretend this can be fixed quickly just because you're ready to try. That was the hardest part for him to hear. Readiness feels like an effort to the person who finally arrives. But arrival doesn't erase absence. An effort, when it comes too late, doesn't restore trust. It only highlights how long it was withheld. He asked if I was leaving. I told him the truth. I'm choosing myself, I said, and our child. Whatever that looks like, it won't involve me being invisible again. There were tears then, his, not mine, not performative, confused, frightened. The tears of someone who realizes that control has slipped, not through force, but through neglect. I didn't comfort him, not out of cruelty, but because this was the moment he needed to sit with what he felt, without me managing it. We talked logistics, not emotionally, but practically, living arrangements, support, boundaries, next steps. It felt surreal how calm it all was, but calm is what happens when decisions are no longer in flux. When we stood up from the table, nothing dramatic happened. No final words, no door slammed. Just a quiet understanding that the version of us that existed before was no longer available, and that whatever came next would have to be built on something entirely different. I am quieter now, but not in the way I used to be. Before, my quiet was an offering, an accommodation, a way of making myself easier to live with. Now it's a boundary. It belongs to me. Life after that conversation didn't reorganize itself overnight. There was paperwork, adjustments, long days, and shorter nights. Co-parenting discussions required more precision than emotion. None of it was cinematic. All of it was real. And through it, I noticed something unexpected. I felt steady, not numb, not detached. Steady in a way that didn't require constant self-monitoring. I no longer scanned rooms to see what needed fixing. I no longer anticipated other people's moods as a survival skill. My energy, once distributed everywhere, began returning to me. Motherhood changed too. I was no longer modeling endurance. I was modeling presence. When I held my child, there was no background calculation, no multitasking of emotional labor. I showed up fully, not because I had to, but because I could. The version of me that once believed love meant staying adaptable has softened into something more solid. I understand now that love without accountability erodes intimacy. That being easy is not the same as being cherished. That reliability, when unreciprocated, becomes a liability. People treat me differently now, not because I'm louder, not because I demand more, but because I no longer overextend to protect them from discomfort. I let pauses linger. I let people feel the natural weight of their choices. I don't rush to rescue conversations or situations that aren't mine to manage. And in that space, something interesting happens. They rise or they reveal themselves. I don't resent my past self. She did what she knew how to do. She survived by smoothing edges and holding things together. But she also taught me something invaluable. That silence is only powerful when it's chosen, not when it's expected. I'm not hardened. I'm clearer. I still believe in kindness. I still believe in partnership. But I no longer confuse patience with loyalty or calm with consent. I understand now that boundaries don't make you unloving. They make love possible without self-erasure. If there's dominance in who I am now, it's not over anyone else. It's over my own life. And that kind of dominance doesn't need to announce itself. It simply holds. There's a temptation when telling a story like this to turn it into a warning or a manifesto, to say never do this or always do that. But real life is quieter and more complicated than rules. What I learned didn't arrive as a lesson. It arrived as a recognition. For a long time, I believed that being calm was the same as being strong, that staying reasonable was a form of maturity, that love meant absorbing imbalance without complaint. And in small doses, those things can be true. But when they become a pattern, when one person carries the weight so consistently that it disappears from view, they stop being virtues and start becoming erasures. No one explicitly told me to be invisible. I volunteered. I did it because it kept things peaceful, because it made me useful, because it earned me praise that sounded like safety, and because I didn't yet understand that harmony built on self-silencing is fragile by design. The quiet dominance people talk about isn't about winning. It isn't about proving anything to someone who failed you. It's about choosing not to abandon yourself anymore. about letting clarity replace negotiation, about understanding that you don't need to perform pain for it to be valid. When my husband missed the birth of our child, when I was in labor for 14 hours while his phone went straight to voicemail, that wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the moment the end became undeniable. Not because it was the worst thing that could happen, but because it revealed the truth of what had already been happening quietly for years. And here's the part that matters most to me now. I didn't need revenge to feel whole again. I didn't need him to fully understand to move forward. I didn't need an apology big enough to rewrite the past. What I needed was alignment. Alignment between what I felt and what I tolerated. Between what I modeled and what I wanted my child to learn. Between who I was becoming and the life I was living. Some people will hear this story and focus on his failure. Others will focus on my silence. Both miss the point. The point is that relationships don't collapse in explosions. They dissolve through an imbalance that goes unchallenged for too long. And the most powerful moment isn't when someone finally apologizes. It's when you realize you no longer need them to. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in the quiet parts, the waiting, the adapting, the way you smooth things over before they can even be named, I want you to know something. Your calm is not an obligation. Your patience is not infinite. And your silence is not consent unless you decide it is. You don't have to become louder to become stronger. You don't have to be hard to be respected. Sometimes the most profound shift happens when you simply stop compensating and allow reality to reveal itself. That's where clarity lives. And clarity, once reached, doesn't shout. It just stays. Before we end, I want to ask you slowly, honestly, without judgment, have you ever realized that the moment you stopped explaining yourself was the moment everything finally became clear? If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear what it stirred up. Your reflections matter more than agreement. Thank you for listening.
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.